Welcome back. Now, according to the recent World Bank report, some 1.4 billion people in the developing world are living on less than $1.25 a day. The report further reveals that some countries like China are reducing poverty levels while others are not. So why the difference? Well, let's take a closer look at Africa. There, half the population is below the poverty line. Many African countries have an overwhelming list of problems: corruption, armed conflict, poor governance, gender inequality, HIV and AIDS, and poor use of resources. In addition, the IMF and World Bank force those countries to open up their markets to Western corporate and financial interests. Well, many analysts say this leaves Africa open to exploitation rather than development. So what's being done to tackle these issues? Let's rejoin our guests. In New York, Diana Alarcon; in London, John Hillary; and in Geneva, Yash Tandon. Yash, let me come to you first, because I know that you've been working with initiatives to improve African trade. I know you were saying earlier that there's been a lot of trade agreements which have not benefited Africa. What do you think about other countries like China, which is now developing so aggressively, coming in and spending billions, investing in African countries on infrastructure, giving them cheap credit? Do African countries benefit from deals like that?
Well, they do indeed. I think what we are now witnessing is a fundamental change in the pattern of trade and investments between Africa and the rest of the world. For the last 50 years, these relations have been dominated by the former colonial relationship that existed, that are still embedded structurally. For example, most of African countries are still negotiating the economic partnership agreements with the European Union. And the European Union has more or less forced on African countries to try to conclude an agreement which is going to create more unemployment and deindustrialization of Africa.
But so why doesn't Africa have the capacity to negotiate better deals?
Well, there is fragmentation in Africa. The earlier efforts in the 1970s and 80s to bring about regional integration in Africa has totally fragmented as a result of carrot and stick policies pursued by the European Union. So they are fragmented, they are divided. For example, in the Southern African region, the SADC region is divided between South Africa on the one hand, negotiating separately with the European Union, and the rest of the countries are negotiating separately again with the European Union. But let me get back to the question that you posed about China and India coming into Africa. Here is an opportunity for African leadership to engage in serious and concrete negotiations with China and India. They must not depend on aid, because that's a wrong way to bring about development. They should enter into commercial agreements and must make sure that they are getting a good deal out of the agreements they're making with China. So here is a possibility for African countries to take this opportunity to carve out for themselves a very different strategy from the one they have been following over the last 50 years.
Well, what do you think, John? I mean, when you have bodies like the EU or the World Bank and they're tying their investment and their offers of help to conditions like privatisation, does that help or hinder these countries?
It's a disaster for developing countries when they're being told you can have some aid, you can have a little bit of assistance, but only on the condition that you import policies which we know lead to more poverty. We've seen huge increases in poverty in those countries which have followed the World Bank and the European Union prescriptions. But I think we also need to recognise that the European Union, and indeed the rich world as a whole, is not coming to this table in an altruistic manner. We have seen in the new, not the old, but the new European Union trade policy towards the rest of the world, a very new aggressive stance saying that we want for European businesses and for European capital to take control of the world's resources. This is exactly what it says in black and white.
That's a really interesting point that you raised there, John. I mean, is this the nub of the problem, that there is no genuine desire to help these countries out of poverty? Rather, it's a desire to exploit them in their own interests?
Well, I'm afraid that's the only conclusion one can draw. We've seen aid levels drop, for example. The UK my own country, dropped its level of aid by 30% last year. Debt relief is still running miles behind what it should be. So developing countries are paying 5 times as much as they're getting in aid from the rich world. And the trade agenda has become more and more unfair as the European Union and the US has tried to force open yet more markets in the developing world. So if you look at the sum total of these actions together, they speak very loudly about a world which is simply not doing anything to alleviate poverty. In fact, it's going in the other direction.
Diana Alarcon, we've seen a history of sort of pseudo-altruistic campaigns, feed the world, let's banish global poverty. But when it comes right down to it, a lot of the onus is on richer countries who could do more to ease the debt, ease trade restrictions, etc. And as John says, it's simply not happening. So how do you make that happen? How do you put the onus on the developed countries to help developing countries?
I think one of the main challenges that we have towards 2015 and beyond is to strengthen the capacity of governments, of national governments, to generate strategies of development that will lead to poverty reduction, to employment creation. It is true there is a lot that global partnerships should be doing to alleviate the living conditions of the poor. It is true that there is a lot that there are large gaps in the commitments that developed countries made in terms of official development assistance, in terms of trade, in terms of debt relief, access to technology, etc. There are large gaps there that have to be filled. But parallel to that, there's got to be an effort in every single developing country to generate and to generate national development strategies and to strengthen the capacity of governments to have better negotiation in international
so
fora,
you're saying,
but also
the governments themselves, should be more committed to improving their own fortunes. Is that what you're saying?
It is governments themselves with a civil society. I mean, there's got to be a way to strengthen the capacity of governments to represent their societies, to represent the interest of these million of people who are now living below, in conditions of poverty.
Yash Tandon, what do you think? Poorer countries should be doing more to help themselves?
I would go one step further. I think the point that Diana is making is correct. But so far, what the World Bank and the IMF have been saying is that our governments in the South, especially in Africa, have not created conditions for outsiders to help Africa. In other words, they have to create conditions for corporates to make investments in Africa. That is wrong. I do not think after 50 years, African countries should depend on aid from outside. They can depend on some amount of capital, especially in the form of machinery and technical know-how, but not monetary capital from outside. Principally, the burden of development must lie with the people.
These countries are rich in resources, but they lack the capacity for production. Don't they need outside help?
Exactly. No. In fact, the 50 years of so-called help from outside has brought about, in Africa, deindustrialization, collapse of the economies, collapse of agriculture, food importation, and locking up African countries in low-value exports. No, they need to reverse all that. They need to focus on garnering their local resources, claiming control over the land, over the mineral wealth they have, and adding value at the level of production.
Very,
and when
very
it comes
briefly,
to production,
John Hillary,
yes.
do you agree with that?
I absolutely agree. I think developing countries have had a very bitter history of suffering at the hands of the rich world, and we're seeing now a very new, solid neo-colonial agenda which is being forced upon them. I think developing countries need to think very, very hard about accepting any more of this so-called aid and advice from the rich North. It's not given with any altruistic means. It's given very much with the self-interest of the rich world at heart. And I think until we start change that particular problem, then we're not going to be able to address the problem of world poverty at all.
OK, thank you all three of you very much indeed for what has been a very interesting discussion. My guests today from New York, Diana Alarcon, in London, John Hillary, and in Geneva, Yash Tandon. And thank you for watching. If you have any comments, suggestions or stories you'd like to see here on Inside Story, drop us an email. We're at insidestory@aljazeera.net. But from me, Shuli Ghosh, and all the team here, bye-bye for now.